We've seen breaches of ceasefires before. How serious is the latest escalation?
Well, you want to remember, we had a tit for tat, like the one that has taken place over the past 3 days between June 9th and June 11th. Remember, the memorandum of understanding was signed on June 17th. What I'm telling you is between the 9th and 11th, there was a tit for tat, just like this one. Involved both the Iranians and the Americans taking shots at each other 2 different times. Back in the June 9th to June 11th window, you remember an Apache helicopter was shut down. Mm-hmm. The Americans responded. The Iranians then responded. The Americans responded again, and the Iranians responded. And the same thing has happened here. It's not an Apache helicopter. It's a tanker and a cargo ship that the Iranians took potshots at in the Strait of Hormuz, and that's led to the United States taking a shot at Iran, Iran taking a shot at Iran taking a shot at the United States, and then one more round. So it's the same basic story. And a lot of people are saying, oh, this means we're on the threat of escalation. We're not on the threat of escalation. We're just trying to decide here who controls the Strait of Hormuz. That's the issue at play. And in fact, it's just been announced that we're going to sit down with the Iranians and try and work this out and put an end to this tit for tat, just as we put an end for the previous tit for tat by signing the memorandum of understanding. And by the way, once an agreement is reached, it will be clear that Iran completely controls the Strait of Hormuz.
You say that, but of course this is in keeping with what you've said time and again, John, that Iran's essentially won the war, which is why Trump has signed this memorandum of understanding, a surrender document, if you like, and that the US has no way out of this situation. That's your line, but let me put this to you. This is Mike Pence, the former US vice president who carries no brief for President Trump. He says the Iranian regime is on its heels. Its military capabilities have been seriously degraded. Its terror proxies have been weakened. Its economy remains under severe pressure. For the first time in many years, the momentum is with the US and our ally Israel. That's Mike Pence. John.
Then why did we sign the memorandum of understanding, which is a surrender agreement? Almost everybody who's looked at that agreement recognizes that. People on the hawkish side of the political spectrum are beside themselves, given that President Trump signed the MOU on June 17th. But President Trump signed it for one very good reason. He had no choice. Mike Pence is operating in a different universe than the rest of us are. And somebody going to try to bring him back down to earth and feed him some facts and teach him a little basic logic. And then he might see the light. I'm not sure. But let's hope that he's not a lost cause, which he appears to be when he makes foolish statements like that.
Well, the consensus among the hawks remains pretty adamant that, Washington must go to great lengths to still dismantle the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, end the militia proxies, and restore freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. They say that Trump still has a lot of leverage. And if Tehran does not conform, especially on the Strait of Hormuz, Tehran will face the full force of the American military again. John.
Tom, let me take a minute or two just to lay out the big picture here, which will show you that that line of argument makes no sense. The war started on February 28th, and on April 8th, the air war part of it ended. So from February 28th to April 8th, we had a 40-day air war. We have not gone back to that air war or even hinted that we would go back to that air war for the past 2 months and 3 weeks. And the reason is very simple. The air war does not provide a war-winning strategy. And in fact, if we started the air war again, it would be Iran that benefited from it. So there's no air war option. Unsurprisingly, on April 13th, remember the air war ends on April 8th, on April 13th, President Trump switches gears and he puts into place the blockade. We go from naval power, we go from air power to naval power. The blockade is on from April 13th to June 17th. That's a little more than 2 months. What happens on June 17th? On June 17th, President Trump signs the Memorandum of Understanding, which is a surrender document. That basically means that the blockade didn't work, because if the blockade had worked, he wouldn't have signed a surrender document. He signed it because the blockade didn't work. So here we are. We've tried air power. It didn't work. And nobody's talking about going back to that. We tried a blockade or naval power. That didn't work, which again is why we signed the Memorandum of Understanding. The third option is land power. And I have not heard anybody make a serious argument that we should put boots on the ground. So the question you want to ask yourself today, Tom, is what are we going to do to up the ante? These people were talking about going up the escalation ladder and teaching the Iranians a lesson, or using all of our coercive leverage to get them to play by our rules. I'd like to know, where's the coercive leverage come from? I just told you what all the options are, and the answer is there is no option.
Yeah, but they would say to you, John, that given the state of Iran's economy, that Tehran could now be overplaying its hand in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, doesn't sanctions relief provide Washington with equally important leverage? John?
No, the point is that Iran faces an existential threat from the United States. The United States and Israel are an existential threat to Iran. And when you face an existential threat, you'll eat grass if that's what's necessary to survive. The idea that the Iranians are suddenly going to throw up their hands and concede defeat to the United States and to Israel, there is zero evidence that that was a possibility up to now. Where's the evidence that we were on the verge of seeing that outcome? I see no evidence whatsoever. The point is, lots of people who don't like this agreement and can't accept the fact that we lost are constantly talking about getting tough, but they never get beyond saying we should get tough and describe exactly what we do and how it produces the victory they desire.
Still has to deal with his critics at home, and they're not just the neoconservatives and Republican lawmakers. They also include some Democrats. And John, they would argue that this deal, which means new revenue, a lot of revenue going to Tehran, that'll simply finance their ballistic missiles, their militia proxies. They're going to spend it on that rather than reconstruction. And the regime, if you like, will invest every penny it receives to furthering its goal of fighting Israel. John?
I think they're basically right. I wouldn't use the categorical or extreme language you use to describe it. I'd use a bit more qualified language. But as I said at the top of the show,
yes,
the Iranians won. You're exactly right. And the hawks are beside themselves. Remember, the hawks said that this was going to turn into a great victory for the United States and Israel. We were going to do all these wonderful things, achieve all these objectives. We've not only achieved none of our stated objectives, we've also lost on a number of other issues. And they're beside themselves. They don't know what to do. And the fact is, there's nothing we can do about it. Iran won.
Yeah, but at what point does official Washington recognise your point? Because at this stage, they seem to be giving Trump a hard time for giving too much away. John?
Well, they are giving Trump a hard time, and Trump feels like he's between a rock and a hard place. He has all those hawks in Washington, plus the Israelis on one side, and then he has a lot of people, I think, like J.D. Vance and probably Steve Witkoff on the other side, telling him that he's just got to cut a deal. And Trump is sophisticated enough to realize he has no choice here. Trump didn't sign that memorandum of understanding because he's a pussycat. He signed it because he felt he had no choice. I mean, Doug hit the nail on the head. He doesn't want to be Herbert Hoover. President Trump said explicitly that we're facing a potential economic catastrophe. He understands that. He had no choice. And all Trump is doing here is delaying the inevitable. At some point, he has to cut a deal. And by the way, Tom, you want to understand what's lurking in the background, and we haven't even talked about it at all. But what really matters, and what many people think was the principal reason we went to war against Iran, is the nuclear issue. We haven't even talked about the nuclear issue yet. And you have to understand that once we get to that, the Iranians are going to have a lot of leverage, and they're going to make it very difficult for us to get a good deal. So this situation only gets worse for us. I mean, the idea that it improves over time and we gain more and more leverage. Sorry, I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, terms. It gets back to a point that, John, we talked about this 2 months ago, and you quite rightly predicted that Trump will have to eat crow. Remember when you said that? Eat crow.
Yes.
Eating crow means acknowledging you were wrong. Can you imagine the American foreign policy establishment conceding defeat on these issues?
But there's a difference between the foreign policy establishment and President Trump. And if you listen to Doug carefully, he was talking about President Trump.
Sure.
And I think Doug is on the money. There's nothing he said that I disagree with. The strait will be open. There's no question there'll be a toll booth there. And I think that the Omanis and the Iranians, who control both sides of the strait, will work out an arrangement. By the way, the problem that exists today, Tom, is that the ships, the tankers and the cargo ships that are leaving the Gulf, for the most part, are going along the Omani coast. So what the Omanis think is Omani territorial waters. And this is what is enraging the Iranians. And the Iranians are saying, any ship that goes through the strait, whether you go through Omani territorial waters or you go through Iranian territorial waters, has to have our permission, which is another way of saying we control the strait, the entire strait. This is not to say a deal won't be worked out with the Omanis over time, but at this point in time, as Arachi said, the foreign minister of Iran, we control the entire strait.
Okay, an important moment in the trajectory of American foreign policy. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, just a slightly different way of coming at it. I think that rhetoric regarding Pax Americana was appropriate during the unipolar moment when we were the only great power on the planet. Then you could think in those terms.
So this is the 1990s and the first 15 years of this century.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And of course, both Doug and I and you, Tom, were not in favor of that attempt to, implement Pax Americana. You could talk about it at the time. But what happened, in my opinion, around 2017 is that we moved into a multipolar world. And we're dealing with China, we're dealing with Russia, and then we're dealing with the Middle East, the war in Iran. That's a sort of additional contingency that matters enormously. Excuse me, but if you think about what's going on in East Asia, you think about the Ukraine war, you think about the Middle East, we do not have a lot of influence in any one of those three areas. In fact, we've not had a lot of success in shutting down the Ukraine war. And with regard to East Asia, we're doing everything we can to keep things peaceful in East Asia because we know we're up to our eyeballs in alligators in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So this notion of Pax Americana, where we lead the world and everybody follows, that's long gone, in my opinion.
Hasn't Iran, though, demonstrated to US allies in Asia that America is somewhat unreliable? John?
Well, I think there is an element of truth in that. You also, just in this context, want to remember that starting in roughly 2011, when Hillary Clinton, who was then Secretary of State, talked about the pivot to Asia, began to pay a lot of attention to increasing our deterrence capability in East Asia. And that started big time under President Trump's first term, started in 2017. It was then continued by President Biden in 2021 to 2025. So we have been pivoting to Asia until the Iran war. And now we're pivoting away from Asia. We pulled THAAD batteries and Patriot batteries. These are air defense batteries out of Japan and South Korea. We moved the Marine Expeditionary Unit out of Japan to the Middle East. And our East Asian allies were deeply concerned about that. And that includes the Australians as well. And I think people were beginning to wonder about how reliable the United States was. In other words, was the United States going to be there for its East Asian allies? Then there's another dimension, which is the one that you're getting at, Tom, which is that we performed pretty poorly in the war against Iran. We basically ran out of weaponry, or we had drawn down our weapons base to the point where we really couldn't continue the war. I mean, you want to understand that one of the principal reasons that we don't want to start the air war is we do not have sufficient munitions to conduct that air war. And all of this tells you if a war were to break out in East Asia at this point in time, I think the United States, from a purely military point of view, would be in real trouble. It's not to say we'd lose, because the Chinese military has all sorts of problems. But you do not want to underestimate the extent to which we have weakened ourselves by fighting this war against Iran. So things do not look good in East Asia. And by the way, Tom, one thing I've been predicting, and this is based on my experience during the Vietnam War, and I'm sure Doug remembers these years very well. But once we lost the war in Vietnam, once it was really all over with in 1975, the United States never wanted to think again about getting involved in a war in Southeast Asia or in a place like Vietnam. So what we did after 1975, for probably a good decade, was we focused laser-like on Europe. NATO and the Warsaw Pact. I would imagine that once this war in the Middle East is over with, the last thing we're going to want to think about is fighting another war against Iran or reconstructing our highly vulnerable military bases in those Gulf states. And I wouldn't be surprised, given all the emphasis we've had on the pivot to Asia since 2011, and given that China is the pacing threat, as people in the Pentagon like to say, I wouldn't be surprised if we focus laser-like on East Asia the way after the war in the Middle East, the way we focused laser-like on Europe after Vietnam. Do you guys know whether either Bill Kristol or Bob Kagan opposed the Iran war beforehand?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that.
I do wonder, Doug, given all of our wars since 1991, the last war that we won in any meaningful way, why anyone who is in favor of all those crazy wars we have fought since then, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Iran, isn't thinking seriously about whether their judgment was correct in the past.
To what extent do you think that the Iran debacle could mark a watershed moment in Washington, in the sense that policy planners, both among Democrats and Republicans, will redefine America's role in the world, less emphasis on the Persian Gulf, less emphasis on Europe, and more focus on Asia?
Well, I would just say there's also just another way of coming at this, Tom. One of the lessons that I hope people learn from this conflict and the previous failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, just to name two, is the limits of military power. This is a different issue than how you prioritize your interests around the world. The issue that you're raising, which is terribly important. I don't mean to take away from that.
Ends and means.
Yeah, that's the ends. That's exactly right. You were talking about the ends. I hadn't thought of it that way, and I was talking about the means. What has struck me over the years, and I'm sure this is true with Doug as well, is the extent to which hawks in the United States believe that the military provides this magic weapon for winning wars quickly and easily and doing social engineering here, there, and everywhere. I mean, the thing I learned early in life, maybe it was because I spent 10 years of my life in the military, is that the military is a blunt instrument and it doesn't always succeed in achieving the goals that's assigned to it. But if you listen to a lot of hawks in the United States over time, over the past few decades, they seem to be wildly optimistic about what you can do if you turn the American military loose. So that's the means part of the story. And I actually do think that people will now sit back and think long and hard about what you could do with military force. And by the way, Tom, some of that will have to do with the fact that we've used such a large part of our inventory of missiles and bombs and other weapons. And therefore, we don't have a lot of weapons to fight a war. But also, I think people have come to realize that military force has limits. But with regard to ends, as I said to you before, I think the focus will be more on East Asia than it has been for the past few years. However, I don't foresee us really abandoning the Middle East, mainly because of the lobby. And the fact that it will go to great lengths to make sure we stay there, at least in good part, to protect Israel. And I don't see us leaving Europe. Trump has done a lot to turn over the Ukraine portfolio to the Europeans. But he still, and the United States still remains quite tied to Ukraine. So I don't see us leaving Europe in a big way anytime soon.
Okay.
I sincerely hope the idea of greater Israel is finished, period. That's my own hope. It's a disgusting idea. There are 8 million Palestinian Arabs, and there is absolutely no cause for genocide or ethnic cleansing or apartheid rule. And there needs to be a solution. And for many people, and it's quite plausible and natural, there should be one state, democratic and binational. And there are many examples of that. I could take Belgium as an example of the Walloons and the Flemish. They haven't always gotten along. There are deep cultural and sectarian and historical differences, but they make two states, by the way. They actually have 5 parliaments in Belgium to handle all of the different complexities of the multi-ethnicities. So Israel could become one state, a binational state, or what has been the international law and the intention of the UN General Assembly for, I would say, all the period since 1947, and then especially after 1967 again, 2 states, a Palestinian state and a state living side by side. Many people say that's now passé. I don't know what's passé. Either solution is possible. What is not possible, in my view, is an apartheid state or continued reckless murder by Israel, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank. And the violence in the West Bank every day is shocking. Israeli settlers dragging Palestinians out, killing them, expropriating their land, burning houses. It's just got to stop this absolutely inhuman behavior and this intergroup hatred and this Jewish power, which is actually the name of one of the political parties that is governing Israel right now, that kind of supremacist idea. It's just got to stop. There are 2 basic reasons why it may be coming to an end right now. And you emphasized one of them, very important. The United States and Israel cannot impose this solution on the region. They thought, well, Israel's invaded Lebanon in the past. It's weakened Hezbollah. Syria has been overthrown. The Iranian reach has been brought down. Hamas has been weakened, if not defeated, by the Gaza war and the Gaza genocide. So one view says that, okay, we're close. All we have to do is overthrow the Iranian regime. Turned out this was delusional. By the way, if they had asked you or they had asked me on February 28th, we would have told them that it was delusional. But they went ahead thinking this would be a one-day war. And it proved not only not a one-day war, but Iran is a sophisticated country, a large country of more than 90 million people. It's got hypersonic missiles. It's got space technology. It's got advanced drone technology. And it has the capacity to destroy a lot of the neighborhood. So it has a deterrent capacity, which it demonstrated, which is why there is this fragile, nascent agreement, because Iran closed the straits, demonstrated military deterrence. The U.S. had no military option that would have been able to avoid a destruction of the Gulf region and the world economy. So in the end, Trump said, okay, we stop this. And that's what this agreement is about. And I agree with Trump on this. Of course, I disagree with him on having started this war, which is fatuous. But I agree with him on ending the war, because what are you going to do? Nothing else. This really is a stalemate. So that's one reason why this Greater Israel project, I hope, is on its last legs. But the other is internal to the United States, and that is that the U.S. has been essentially the backstop of the Greater Israel project. Europe, for many reasons, does Israel's bidding to an extent, but there's much, much less backing. And the U.S. has backed it because the power of the Zionist lobby has been great, and it's been a kind of dual lobby. One is the American Jews and their relations with Israeli Jews and promoting this cause. And the second has been the Christian Zionists like Huckabee. And that's been a formidable lobby in the United States for 30 years. But what's happened, Glenn, is that with the genocide in Gaza, people watching this every day, people coming to understand, what is this about? And why isn't there a state of Palestine alongside a state of Israel? Why isn't there some solution to this? And hearing that the Arabs are saying, yes, we would have peace and normal relations if there's a state of Palestine. The Arab Peace Initiative. Americans have come to understand something is really wrong with this picture. And so in just 3 years, American public opinion has swung from support of Israel to support of the Palestinian people. And the view of Israel is hugely negative. And the attitude towards the war in Iran is devastatingly negative. Americans hated the war. They hated the war because it was useless, it was expensive, and it raised their gasoline prices. And it was cruel, killing 160 schoolgirls on the first day because Palantir couldn't get its targeting right. Come on. So the American people were completely disgusted by this. And Trump is also looking at this, and he's facing an election in early November. And what happened, Glenn, in my city, in New York City, a couple of days ago is absolutely amazing. New York City is the greatest concentration of Jews, American Jews. It's a very Jewish, it's not a Jewish city, but it's got a very strong Jewish population. And the voters of New York voted for the anti-Greater Israel candidates. We had one congressional primary election, 2 Jews running against each other. One was his current congressman who supported the normal, we love Israel, we support what Israel does. And the other, a city councilman who said, I'm running against what Israel's extremism, and I'm running against my candidate who is for it. So anybody that says this has to do with anti-Semitism or something else knows nothing. This was 2 Jews running against each other. And the anti-Israel candidate won in a landslide. And then there were two other congressional races, basically, that weren't two Jews running against each other, but not even Jewish candidates. But in fact, the candidates that said, we stand with the Palestinian people, won decisive victories. That's New York City. This is happening across the United States. I keep telling, I've said it from the first days of Israel's war in Gaza, and I've said it to the Israeli ambassador to the UN, and I've said it as many times as possible. Israel is losing its only support because of its extremism. Americans would support Israel, but they do not support Greater Israel.